Alrighty, we are back in this little series. This is episode 3. I kid you not, I literally bought a $25 DLC just to make this video. Alright, the levels of determination and sheer will and commitment to this video and to this series is absolutely insane. Now, as you can notice, these are all M4s. All M4s. And, it's great. It's absolutely great. So, here is all the T-34s except for the 57mm, since those never saw combat. I'm not including them. I am including, however, all of these that have or I guess I should say seen combat. So, we're going to be settling the age-old dispute on which is better, the T-34s or the M4s. So, obviously, the M4 Shermans, as the British tended to call them, are the American tanks used in World War II, while the T-34s are what the Soviets used. Now, as you can see, there is a vast number of things we are using here today, but we are, of course, going to be using a scoring system. Now, I will be ranking these off a certain list here. We will have the M4s in the top somewhere on the left side of the screen, and then on the right side we will have the T-34 tally counters for points that these things have rightfully earned. Now, the scoring system I have is 10 different categories, so there is a chance to tie, but you know what? There is a tiebreaker just in case that does happen. But I already made the list ahead of time, and I can already tell you now one of them is actually superior, but we'll get to which one it is. So, which one did come first? Now, the T-34s did come first. 1940 was the first one, and these did not really come out until, I believe, 1942. Yeah, they did not come out until 1942. So, the T-34s had more combat experience when they were first deployed. However, first does not always mean better. So, we are going to be... Oh, and a little disclaimer here. There is a specific model of tank that is going to preside a bit of a problem, and that is the Jumbo, or the M4A3E2. These Jumbos are heavily armored, extremely armored, and they are absolute beasts. But I am actually excluding the Jumbo from this list because they're kind of, with how heavily armored they are on the firepower, they start to kind of categorize more as a heavy tank, not a medium tank. I mean, they still fall into the M4 category, which they tend to be mediums, but I am not, however, including that on this list, just to make things a little more fair, because I'll be honest, if the Jumbo was included, the M4s would take the cake. But excluding the Jumbo, this is what we got here. So, the reason I excluded the Jumbo is because the first category is armor. Which one had the better armor? Now, we are going off paper here. So on paper, which one had better armor? I will get into, in the practice, how things actually turn out. But on paper is what I'm looking at right now. So the T-34s, when they first came out in 1940 and in 1941, as you can see, they were angled in such a way that the German rounds would just skip off the armor platings. And this was revolutionary for the time because it wasn't just angled in the front. As you can see, they're angled on the back, on the sides. They're angled in practically every which direction. However, the M4s, they're only angled in the front. The front has much better, angled armor, but the side armor was a bit of a weakness. So that was kind of, and depending on, as you can see, they have different fronts. Here, there is a big weakness. So if you look at this M4 right here, right, you see these bolts, this hole right here? Yeah, that was a big weak point. It's really just, how do you go about armor here? Because when these came out and at the times they were made, yeah, that's just the thing. There is going to have to be a category because there's early, mid, and late war, World War II. And how do you classify? Well, early war, the T-34s get a point in armor, but mid-war, it would go to the M4s for having the better armor. But if you include late war, by the time you got the upgunned M4s, they still didn't tend to have as good as armor things were still able to pin them quite easily. And at this point, you had these T-34 85s, which held up a bit more of the ground, but I would argue that the T-34 85s are actually worse models than the earlier ones. But I think just barely, if we go look at the effectiveness of how they were on paper, I'd say the T-34 gets it to the armor. But hear me out. I will have a comment on this further, because obviously there's some of you that are going to be like, oh, well, the T-34s, man, they didn't have, like, the armor quality sucked. They were super brittle. Sometimes they weren't even fully welded right. I'll get to that later. But as of right now, on paper, I'm giving armor to T-34. But there is something that will come up later. What about... Yeah, I think we should talk about crew survivability next. So crew survivability, which one had the better crew survivability? And just better crew environments. Obviously, the T-34s, see how low to the ground these are compared to the M4s? Yeah, crew comfort was really not a factor when they were designing this. Crews hated being in these, especially in the smaller T-34s. They were just so small. And it was just death traps. See, the M4s had better crew survivability. So I'm giving this point to the M4. I mean, they started getting wet ammo storage or stowage. So basically what they would do is, yeah, this one has wet ammo storage. They would put these rounds so they wouldn't like catch fire and blow up, and they'd have multiple escape hatches, a few on the bottom. Actually, I wonder if they have modeled the hatches on the bottom of the tanks. No, I don't think they have. But yeah, so I think crew survivability easily goes to the M4. So it is right now 1-1 tie, and that goes from early. I guess technically the M4s weren't really part of early war, so that goes for mid and late war. Therefore, if they win both of those, that's already 2-1. So bam, M4 gets the point there. Next is mobility. Which ones were more mobile? Now they both are medium tanks. They both move relatively fast, but one has more horsepower, moves faster, and is overall just more mobile, and that would be the T-34s. They get a point in mobility. It's just like they have higher top speed, easier handling because they're shorter to the ground. They're not like taller like these ones, like the M4s are. So mobility is going to go to T-34. I really don't think people would disagree with me on this one, but I know people are going to disagree with armor, because I know what I pointed out is kind of difficult, but as of on paper, yeah. Anyways, mobility points T-34, currently 2-1. Now if we go to technology, as you can see, the M4s had quite a bit of technology here. So technology is going to go to the M4, not only just because the 50 cals and the Calliope, or the Calliope, however you want to say it, and, you know, inventions like this, but they also had, like I mentioned earlier, the wet ammo storage, gun stabilizers. All right, yeah, gun stabilizers, and they just had better gun sights. So the technology point is going to go to the M4, easily, hands down. You don't have to agree with me. Like I feel like a lot of people would agree with me, actually. So, yeah, technology points going to the M4. Currently a tie. We are ready. All right. Yeah. Now for firepower. This one I'm going to get about as much flack as what I've said for armor, and that's going to give you an idea to what I'm about to say for firepower. When the T-34 came out, it was able to very easily deal with the Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs in the early war. These didn't get their experience until mid-war, but by mid-war, their guns were good. Don't get me wrong, they were good in the desert, but after that, they started to have issues because they started encountering more Panthers, Stugs, Yag Panthers, Tigers. You know, they started encountering heavier stuff, and their guns couldn't really deal with it, and honestly, these couldn't either. But yeah, I mean, mid-war, the T-34s honestly were probably a little bit, just slightly better in mid-war. But late war, the T-34 85 millimeter versus the, of course, 76 millimeter gun barrels. Bigger cannon doesn't necessarily mean better firepower here. The 76 millimeter W, I think, actually does have more pinning capability, But I looked into it, and it's actually not really the gun itself. The Americans had better tank rounds, but the Soviets had a better cannon, but their tank rounds weren't the greatest because of the cheap gunpowder and all that, which most of that they did get resolved at the end of the war. But so it's like, wow, firepower. The tank round is part of technology. So yes, the M4s would pin just slightly more armor, but that's because they had better rounds. But for firepower alone, if you include high explosive, I'm going to have to give it to the T-34-85s. I hope you understand the reasoning. Technology, the M4s had a better round, and they had gun stabilizers, so I am giving them credit for that. But just out of sheer firepower alone, not necessarily just talking about the tank round, I'd have to give it to the 85. But don't worry, there's still plenty of time for the M4 to get its time to shine. Now, if we go to reliability, reliability, both from early to mid-war, they both had their issues. The M4s had, many reports of them just supposedly catching fire, the engines catching fire, and, things would sometimes break down. T-34s, especially the earlier models, it was really hard to shift into gear. The transmissions would break easily on the early models. And honestly, dust and sand, if anything was in, like a deserty environment, would mess with the T-34 engines. They had a cold start option, which in winter weather, they're fine. These tanks had a cold start option. The Germans didn't. They had to, start their engines normally. This had a 2-system starting thing. But they weren't the most reliable, at least compared to the M4s. M4's point is going to go to reliability for the M4s. It is just... the M4s were more reliable. They both were reliable tanks, but the T-34s just had a little bit more issues there in the early and mid-war periods. So, reliability point is going to go to the M4. Now, what about the cost? Which ones did they cost? Now, I looked up the prices. I did Google them. You're just going to have to trust me on this. They were both really cheap to make. However, the T-34 costed less to build than the M4. So in cost, the T-34 is going to get this point because they were cheaper to build than the M4s. So now, cheaper doesn't always mean better, but, something that's easily fixable for the most part. It's got a lot of parts for it, and it's even cheaper to make. Yeah, they're going to get a point for cost. But what about variety? Variety is the next category. And as you can see, I think it's very obvious which one's going to get variety here. And I don't even have all the M4s. I don't even have the mine clearer one set out, like the mine clearance. So in terms of variety, the different things, M4 is taking this easily. Come on, man. There was an M4 for quite literally anything. You want an M4 that's going to have, artillery capabilities? There's an M4 for that. If you want an M4 that's like a heavy tank able to deal and take hits, there's an M4 for that. All right. If you want an M4 that's able to go on water, there's an M4 for that. Mine clearance M4? Yeah. There's even an M4 with a bulldozer blade that can clear debris. There was literally an M4 for everything. There was even an anti-air M4. In Britain, mostly, it was called the Skink, but I'm mainly looking at Americans here. But I will mention, the Sherman Firefly, because, that thing's not an insane gun. And honestly, if I was including British variants, the firepower would go to M4, but because the Firefly, but Americans only. But yeah, my point still stands. Variety is going to go to M4 because there's quite literally a Sherman for everything. So what's next? What do we have left to cover? Well, there's 2 more categories left to cover, and that is quantity and quality. Now, quantity. Who's taking quantity? There was about, I'm going to round up here and say there was about 50,000 M4s made, at least by the end of World War II. But there was just slightly more T-34s made, although I think it would have been a tie if they both came out at the same time, or honestly, maybe the M4s would have taken it. But the fact these came out in 1940 and went all the way to 1945, these started in 1942 and went all the way to 1945. The T-34s win in quantity. They had more T-34s made. But there is something we do need to mention here, and that was quality. Which one had better quality? That's the M4. Why? Because for the Lend-Lease Act that was passed when the Soviets had M4s, like even the Soviets had M4s, the crew members liked the M4s. They had diesel engines when, diesel was a cheaper fuel for them to use. They were more comfortable, and they just were a much better quality tank. They were more reliable. So quality is going to go to the M4. Now, of course, we're sitting here and it's now a tie. It is a tie. So what are we going to do? We've tied 5-5. But that is on paper. Now let me discuss in practice. So all of these on paper, you start to get these issues. So let me cover my two most controversial topics here, and that is armor and firepower. On paper, what I mentioned was in favor of the T-34, but in practice, the M4s had just better armor and just better firepower in practice. Because the T-34s, they weren't all exactly the same quality. When they were making these tanks, some would have poorer welds than others. So as you can see here, all of these, especially late war. I mean, people nowadays, if you're comparing like a modern day T-34-85 that's still running, yeah, that was post World War II. They were better. And plus, you have the Korean War where M4s did encounter combat with T-34s, and I think 29 T-34s were taken out and 7 M4s were taken out. Now, to be fair, the T-34s were not piloted, or I guess not piloted, not driven with Soviet tank commanders that had experience. They were driven with Korean soldiers that didn't have a lot of tank experience, with the M4s having more tank experience because it was the American crews. So, I mean, credit where it's due there. Is it really the most fair combat? But, still. On paper, this is a tie. But in combat, when it was battlefield tested, I think when you're excluding certain factors, like even with me excluding the jumbo, in practice, the M4 was better. If I put the jumbo in, on paper, the M4s would have won this debate. But I just wanted to point this out here because even though it looks good on paper, doesn't mean it necessarily performed that well. Now, in my personal opinion, yeah, the M4 is better. Do I like the look of the T-34 better? Oh, yeah. I mean, look at these things. Look at the M4s. They just look like a stubby, I don't know. They just look weird to me. These, I love the look of these. And honestly, I don't know. I just really like the Eastern Front. That's usually kind of what pulled me into World War II in the first place. I like the look. And honestly, if I wanted to include camouflage, these would take the cake because they're smaller and they're green naturally off the factory, blending in with their environment. But I didn't want to let my own personal biases get into this list. So as much as I love the T-34, and I actually favor the T-34s more than the M4s, the M4s were just better. Now, it's not saying that I don't like the M4s. I mean, come on. This one right here at the rocket racks is cool, one of my favorites. I love the jumbos. I mean, I love the M4s, but I like the T-34s more. But yeah, that pretty much settles the debate here on which is better. I've been trying to decide this for so long because because for like a year, I could not figure out which was better because I kept being like, they're like the same thing. Because you see, the M4 and the T-34 is like my ex-girlfriend, all right? We're very different tanks, but we're also very similar tanks. What one of us was good at, the other one sucked at. I think you know where I'm getting at here. Where one of us was good in all these aspects, the other one was not so good in those aspects, but made up for the difference. So we kind of, yeah, that basically just sums up that. I mean, come on. The M4 to the T-34 is like the Deadpool into the Wolverine. They're similar. They both have healing factors, but they're also very different. So yeah, the M4 and the T-34, comparing them, I don't think we should really compare them because they're both really good tanks. They were both key to winning the war. And honestly, at least in Europe, I think it was definitely more of a war between the Germans and the Soviets. Now, obviously, the Americans and the British needed to be there to help assist the Soviets to winning, but this was the main war in Europe that went on. I mean, if it wasn't for D-Day, the Soviets would have been having to fight for a little bit longer and lost a little more troops. Because they say World War II was won with British intelligence, American industry, and Soviet blood. And that, my friends, is the end of the video for today. Between the settling debate of the M4 Sherman and the T-34. If you guys agree with me, let me know in the comments. If you want to add a few more interesting facts that I did not cover, feel free to do that. And if you straight up do not agree with me, I want to see your reasonings, because I like both tanks, and I honestly would love both sides to win. But from what I see, there's only one tank that's truly better. Adios. And see you next time.